The process of making decisions, and a lot of people, when they hear the word ethics, I don't know what you thought when you were coming to a session about ethics tonight, but often we encounter people who feel kind of instantly judged or worried, concerned, like, oh, ethics, I'm going to be checked out to see if I'm doing the right thing. And that's one way of thinking about it, but I find it's much more effective and helpful to think about ethics as the conditions in which humans flourish. The first one is pretty common in business settings. It's sort of a cost benefit analysis, might be the way that it gets discussed in your enterprise. But it's utilitarianism. What's the greatest good for the greatest number, or how do we minimize harm? We talk a lot about human rights these days in business settings, and that's very encouraging. The Global Compact, the United Nations Global Business Compact, has really elevated the attention that companies are paying to human rights. And so there's a set of questions for each one of these lenses that we can ask ourselves to make sure that people are being afforded the appropriate amount of dignity and respect simply for being a human being. But the challenge with rights is often that we find, people have individual rights that are in conflict with one another. So we need other lenses sometimes to work that out and resolve them. We talk about fairness and justice. And again, this is a pretty familiar lens. A lot of people are conversant with this. We think about proportionality in this lens and making sure that we're evenly distributing the benefits and the burdens. And we look both at the process, but also the outcomes, because sometimes the process can look fair, but it still leads to unfair outcomes. So then there needs to be some adjustment. And one that we don't talk about as much, although I think it's starting to be understood more clearly, and the pandemic has probably helped us with that, is the common good. Is this idea that there are some things that serve the community as a whole, and that they sometimes need to be elevated over the individual or subgroup interests within the community. A lot of people talk about public goods, which are really tangible things like roads, public education, libraries, those kinds of a healthcare system. Those are all some examples of the common good. We talk about virtues. And this is sort of how each one of us can be our best selves. And a lot of people have really leaned on this one quite heavily in the recent history, really emphasized this in educational settings. And there is a way to think about your organization's reputation as well, and the way that you're behaving as an employee within an organization. And does it represent the values, or usually the way that we talk about it in enterprise settings. And we're adding one. We haven't updated the framework for many years, but we are adding one about the ethics of care, which is grounded in a lens of feminist ethics, so relevant to a group of women leaders. And this really is looking at the fact that we have some obligations that get prioritized based on the relationships we have, some decisions that we make based on because we're thinking about other people's feelings or emotions and taking those into account. And it has a little bit to do with how moral judgment is developed in human beings. So an original model that was developed by a guy named Larry Kohlberg sort of captured the various levels of moral development, which is a lot like reading and writing. It turns out, there's certain skills, first you have to learn to cut with scissors and things like that when you're a toddler before you can translate some of those things to reading and writing. And the same thing is true with ethical reasoning. So people might start off very focused on themselves and how they get what they want or stay out of trouble. Then they might become more oriented towards other people. But ultimately, we want them to reach a level of decision making where they have a pretty fully formed conscience of their own. We put all of this into a framework, a decision-making model that asks first for people to identify that they have an ethical issue. One of my colleagues always starts by saying, can somebody be harmed? Because it is the easiest way to figure out if there's an ethical issue. But these other questions also help you identify that there's something on the table that has to do with ethics. And again, if you just think about things that help people flourish, I think that's as good a check on whether or not ethics is in the mix. And we also talk about the fact that the law is really kind of the floor. It's the minimum. And ethics often is going beyond what the law requires. So there many times in business settings, people will say, but it's legal. Yeah, that's true. But you really need to look at some other parts of your organization's mission, vision, and values to decide, is it also ethical? Is it the way we think of doing something right in our organization? We encourage people to get the facts, and I just mentioned what's so challenging about that right now. We have an app that you can download that helps you to sort of walk through this particular rubric and think through the questions that the lenses provide. But really, the first part is just making sure that you get all the data. And identifying stakeholders is key, and it is really such a part of the context of decision making in ethics. Making sure that you've got those stakeholders' interests represented, that wherever you can, maybe you've included them in the decision making. That's also pretty important. And then you ask the questions that go along with the 6 lenses. And at that point, you can make a decision. You can maybe have an opportunity to talk it over with someone before you use it, or do it in an experimental way before you scale it. But this is sort of the rinse and repeat part of the model. You want to make sure that after you've implemented it, that you come back and you reflect on the decision that you've made and any learning that's come from that, so that when you come up to that same set of issues in the future, you've got even more information and more data that you can draw upon.